Dating today isn't confusing because people don't know what they want. It's confusing because people are pretending they don't know what they want. Older men and women are not lost. They're overstimulated, emotionally exhausted, and deeply conflicted. And that conflict is exactly where dating begins to slip out of control. Because when experience meets fear and desire meets trauma, the rules change. What once felt simple now feels chaotic. What once felt intentional now feels reactive. And most people don't realize they're not choosing partners anymore. They're choosing patterns. The first sign that dating has gone out of control for older men and women is this. They confuse freedom with avoidance. They call it independence. They call it protecting their peace. But underneath that language is a refusal to be emotionally accountable. Older daters often say, I don't want drama, but what they really mean is, I don't want to do emotional labor. They want connection without responsibility, intimacy without vulnerability, companionship without inconvenience. And that mindset turns dating into a marketplace instead of a meeting of two humans. When you've lived long enough to be hurt, disappointed, or betrayed, your nervous system learns shortcuts. It learns to scan for threats instead of possibilities. So older men and women start dating defensively. They don't ask, is this person aligned with me? They ask, how fast can this go wrong? That fear doesn't make them wiser. It makes them colder. They ghost instead of communicate. They disappear instead of clarify. They keep options open, not because they have abundance, but because they're terrified of choosing wrong again. And that fear creates emotional chaos, not just for them, but for everyone they touch. Older men often fall into the illusion of endless choice. They mistake attention for attraction and attraction for compatibility. Dating apps reward surface-level appeal, not depth. So instead of slowing down, they speed up. Instead of investing, they sample. They become addicted to novelty because novelty doesn't ask anything of them. It doesn't challenge their habits. It doesn't expose their emotional blind spots. But the more they chase novelty, the harder it becomes to tolerate real connection, because real connection requires consistency, and consistency feels boring to a nervous system addicted to stimulation. Older women, on the other hand, often over-romanticize resilience. They pride themselves on being strong, self-sufficient, and unbothered. But strength becomes a mask when it's used to avoid softness. Many older women don't struggle to attract attention. They struggle to allow intimacy. They've learned to survive alone, so partnership feels optional rather than essential. And when connection feels optional, effort decreases. They expect men to prove themselves endlessly, while offering emotional access only in fragments. That imbalance turns dating into a power struggle instead of a partnership. The second sign dating is out of control is emotional recycling. Older men and women don't enter new relationships emotionally clean. They bring unresolved anger, grief, and mistrust from the past, and then punish the present for it. They say they've moved on, but their reactions tell a different story. A delayed text feels like abandonment. A boundary feels like rejection. A disagreement feels like betrayal. And suddenly, small moments carry the emotional weight of old wounds. This is where dating becomes irrational. People overreact, under-communicate, and self-sabotage, not because the current situation is dangerous, but because it reminds them of one that once was. Instead of healing, they harden. Instead of reflecting, they project. They expect new partners to compensate for old pain, and no one can carry that burden for long. Older men often cope with emotional recycling by emotionally detaching. They stay physically present but emotionally unavailable. They offer structure without warmth, logic without empathy. They believe vulnerability weakens their position, so they withhold it. But emotional withholding doesn't create control. It creates distance. and distance doesn't protect a relationship. It slowly starves it. Older women often cope by overanalyzing. They dissect tone, timing, and behavior, looking for certainty where none exists. They test instead of trust. They pull back to see if someone will chase, forgetting that emotionally healthy people don't chase confusion. They walk away not because the relationship is wrong, but because uncertainty feels unbearable. And so potential connections die not from incompatibility, but from emotional impatience. The third sign dating is out of control is the loss of emotional pacing. Everything is either rushed or delayed. Nothing flows naturally. Older daters either want instant clarity or endless ambiguity. They either demand commitment too early or avoid it indefinitely. This lack of pacing creates instability because attraction needs mystery, but security needs consistency. And when you imbalance the two, relationships collapse before they have a chance to stabilize. Older men often rush physical intimacy while delaying emotional commitment. They want closeness without definition. They want loyalty without labels. And when asked for clarity, they retreat, not because they don't care, but because commitment forces them to confront their own emotional limitations. Older women often rush emotional depth while delaying physical openness. They want reassurance before relaxation. They want certainty before surrender. And while that makes sense intellectually, emotionally it creates pressure. Because connection thrives in curiosity, not interrogation. When every interaction feels like a test, attraction fades. What's most dangerous about dating being out of control is that people stop being honest with themselves. They say they want love, but their behavior is optimized for control. They say they want partnership, but they design their lives to avoid dependency. They say they want peace, but they keep choosing chaos because chaos feels familiar. Older men and women don't need more dating advice. They need more emotional honesty. They need to admit that experience doesn't automatically equal maturity, that healing isn't passive, that independence shouldn't eliminate intimacy, and that protecting yourself too much can be just as damaging as not protecting yourself at all. When dating regains control, it doesn't become easier, it becomes clearer. People stop chasing potential and start observing patterns. They stop performing and start participating. They stop fearing loss and start valuing alignment. And most importantly, they stop dating to avoid loneliness and start dating to build connection. Because real control in dating isn't about having options. It's about having boundaries, emotional regulation, and the courage to be seen. Not perfectly, not defensively, but honestly. And when honesty finally enters the picture, it doesn't arrive gently. It arrives as discomfort because honesty forces older men and women to confront something they've been avoiding for years. The fact that their biggest obstacle in dating is no longer other people. It's themselves, their habits, their defenses, their emotional reflexes. The very strategies that once helped them survive are now preventing them from connecting. Older men often underestimate how visible emotional detachment really is. They believe silence equals strength, restraint equals control, and minimal effort equals mystery. But emotional absence doesn't create intrigue, it creates insecurity. Women don't pull away because they want drama. They pull away because they feel unseen. When conversations stay surface level, when feelings are dodged instead of discussed, attraction slowly converts into doubt. And doubt, once it settles in, doesn't need conflict to grow. It grows quietly in unanswered questions and unmet emotional cues. Older women, meanwhile, often underestimate how heavy emotional guardedness can feel. They think being selective means being distant. They confuse discernment with detachment. They believe withholding warmth protects them from disappointment, without realizing that warmth is what allows connection to breathe. When vulnerability is rationed too carefully, men don't feel challenged, they feel excluded. And exclusion doesn't motivate commitment, it encourages disengagement. This is where dating becomes transactional. Effort is calculated, texts are timed, affection is measured. People keep score instead of building trust. And once dating turns into strategy, sincerity becomes collateral damage. Everyone is trying to win, but no one is trying to understand. Older daters don't ask, how can we grow together? They ask, who has the upper hand? And the moment dating becomes about leverage, intimacy evaporates. Another subtle way dating spirals out of control is when people confuse chemistry with compatibility. Older men and women have strong instincts, but instincts shaped by unresolved trauma can be misleading. Intense attraction often feels like connection, but intensity without stability burns fast and leaves damage behind. Calm feels boring only to those addicted to emotional turbulence. And many older daters mistake peace for lack of passion because chaos is what they learn to associate with love. So they chase familiar pain, the emotionally unavailable partner, the inconsistent attention, the hot and cold dynamic, because uncertainty keeps them engaged. It activates old wounds and gives them something to fix, chase, or prove. And while they call this spark, it's often just anxiety wearing the mask of desire. Healthy connection doesn't spike cortisol, it stabilizes it. But stability feels uncomfortable when your nervous system has never learned how to rest in it. Older men often say they want a low-maintenance woman without realizing what they're actually asking for is emotional invisibility. They want someone who doesn't ask too much, feel too deeply, or need too often. But relationships aren't built on absence, they're built on presence. And presence requires emotional availability, not just physical consistency. When men avoid emotional engagement, they don't stay free, they stay unfulfilled. Older women often say they want a grown man, but then reject men who show emotional openness because it disrupts the image of control. They say they want communication, but only when it feels safe, polished, and predictable. Real communication isn't always neat. It's vulnerable. It's awkward. It reveals uncertainty. And when women shut that down, they don't filter out weak men. They filter out honest ones. Dating loses balance when people stop allowing imperfection. Older men and women expect emotional fluency without emotional practice. They want partners who are healed, self-aware, and secure without asking whether they themselves are offering the same. They forget that growth happens in relationship, not before it. That love is not a reward for being perfect, but a process that exposes what still needs attention. And so dating becomes lonely even when it's active. People go on dates, have conversations, share moments, yet feel disconnected because no one is fully present. Everyone is holding back a piece of themselves just in case it doesn't work, just in case they get hurt, just in case they lose control. But withholding doesn't prevent pain, it guarantees distance. Older men and women often say, I don't have time for games, yet they participate in them unconsciously. Mixed signals, delayed responses, strategic silence, emotional testing. These behaviors aren't signs of maturity, they're signs of fear, dressed up as sophistication. True maturity is direct, it's calm, it's consistent. It doesn't need performance or power plays to feel secure. When dating is truly out of control, people stop listening. They hear words, but they don't absorb meaning. They react instead of respond. They interpret instead of inquire. And slowly, connection erodes, not through conflict, but through misunderstanding. Because understanding requires curiosity, and curiosity requires humility. And humility is difficult when experience convinces you that you already know how this ends. Older men and women don't fail at dating because they care too much. They fail because they care too cautiously. They ration effort, they ration emotion, they ration hope. And while that may protect them from disappointment, it also prevents fulfillment. Because love doesn't grow in controlled environments, it grows in emotionally safe ones. And safety is built through openness, not avoidance. And avoidance has a way of disguising itself as wisdom. Older men and women often tell themselves they are being realistic, when in truth they are being emotionally conservative. They limit investment not because the situation demands it, but because their past has trained them to expect loss. Experience, when unexamined, doesn't create clarity. It creates rigidity, and rigidity suffocates connection long before conflict ever appears. Another layer where dating slips further out of control is the obsession with control itself. Older daters want to manage outcomes instead of experiencing process. They want guarantees before they give effort, certainty before they allow attachment. But relationships are not contracts. They are evolving emotional systems. When people try to control how much they feel, how fast they feel it, and how deeply they allow someone in, they interrupt the very mechanism that builds trust. Older men often try to control dynamics by staying emotionally unpredictable. They believe being hard to read keeps them desirable. But unpredictability doesn't create attraction in emotionally mature women. It creates instability. Stability doesn't kill desire. Inconsistency kills safety. And without safety, desire turns into anxiety, then resentment. When men resist emotional transparency, they aren't protecting themselves from dependency. They are preventing intimacy from forming at all. Older women often try to control dynamics by emotionally overfunctioning. They analyze, anticipate, and preemptively adjust. They read between lines that haven't been written yet. This hyper-awareness feels like intelligence, but it's often anxiety in disguise. When a woman constantly monitors the emotional climate, she doesn't feel secure, she feels responsible. And responsibility without reciprocity breeds exhaustion, not connection. Dating becomes unbalanced when people mistake self-protection for self-respect. Boundaries are meant to clarify, not isolate. Yet older men and women often build walls so thick that no one can reach them. They say, "I know my worth." But worth doesn't need to be defended constantly. True self-worth allows room for curiosity, negotiation, and emotional risk. Without risk, dating becomes sterile, efficient, but empty. Another sign things are out of control is when people stop being present and start being evaluators. Every interaction becomes an assessment. Every moment is scored. Instead of asking, "How do I feel with this person?" they ask, "Does this fit my criteria?" Chemistry becomes secondary to checklists. And while standards are healthy, connection cannot be engineered. You don't fall into resonance through logic alone. You arrive there through shared emotional experience. Older men often overvalue compatibility on paper and undervalue emotional attunement. They choose partners who look right, sound right, and make sense socially, but they ignore how disconnected they feel privately. Emotional dissonance doesn't disappear with time, it intensifies. And when men ignore it, they don't avoid conflict, they delay it. Older women often overvalue emotional intensity and undervalue emotional consistency. They seek depth quickly, craving reassurance that something real is forming. But depth without stability feels overwhelming. When intensity replaces pacing, attraction burns fast and collapses. Real intimacy is built slowly through repetition, reliability, and emotional safety, not accelerated vulnerability. Dating also goes out of control when people confuse communication with constant access. Older daters either demand too much availability or provide too little. There is no rhythm, only extremes. Healthy connection needs space and presence, not surveillance and disappearance. When communication lacks balance, it creates insecurity on one side and pressure on the other. And imbalance is the fastest way to erode desire. Many older men and women also struggle with letting go of their identity as someone who's been through a lot. Pain becomes part of their narrative. It shapes how they interpret behavior, how quickly they assume intent, how guarded they remain. But when suffering becomes identity, healing feels like betrayal of self. So they stay vigilant, armored, and emotionally distant, not because they haven't healed, but because they don't know who they'd be without the armor. Dating doesn't fall apart all at once. It fragments quietly, through small moments of withdrawal, through conversations that stay shallow, through emotional bids that go unanswered, through the gradual replacement of curiosity with assumption. And by the time people realize something is missing, they blame timing, compatibility, or luck, anything but the emotional patterns they keep repeating. Older men and women don't need to start over in dating. They need to slow down enough to notice themselves, to notice when fear is making decisions, to notice when control is replacing connection, to notice when protection is costing them intimacy. Because the moment dating comes back into balance is not when the right person appears. It's when people stop approaching connection as a threat and start approaching it as a shared experience that unfolds, not one that needs to be mastered. And mastery is exactly what many older men and women are secretly chasing, the belief that if they can just understand dating well enough, analyze it deeply enough, or approach it strategically enough, they can finally avoid pain. But love has never been something you conquer. It's something you participate in, and participation requires presence, not perfection. Another place where dating slips further out of control is when people begin outsourcing responsibility for their emotional state. Older daters often say, if they were clearer, I'd feel calmer, or if they showed up differently, I'd be more open. But emotional regulation cannot be delegated. When someone's mood, security, or self-worth depends entirely on another person's behavior, dating becomes unstable by default, because no one can carry the weight of being someone else's emotional anchor and romantic interest at the same time. Older men frequently struggle with emotional articulation. They feel deeply but speak minimally. They assume actions should speak for themselves, forgetting that emotional clarity requires language. Silence is not neutral, it's interpretive. And when men withhold verbal reassurance, women don't feel grounded, they feel uncertain. Uncertainty doesn't inspire patience. It inspires emotional withdrawal or overcompensation. Older women, on the other hand, often articulate emotions fluently but struggle with emotional restraint. They explain, re-explain, and process out loud, hoping clarity will create safety. But when emotional expression becomes constant justification, it loses its grounding power. Men don't pull away from feelings. They pull away from emotional intensity that feels uncontained. Balance is what keeps dialogue alive, not volume. Dating also loses its center when people confuse effort with pressure. Older men sometimes equate leadership with control, pushing relationships forward before emotional readiness exists. Older women sometimes equate seriousness with urgency, accelerating conversations about future outcomes before trust has stabilized. When pace is forced, authenticity collapses. People start agreeing instead of aligning, and agreement without alignment doesn't last. Another overlooked factor is emotional fatigue. Older men and women are tired of starting over, tired of explaining themselves, tired of investing only to detach again. But fatigue doesn't mean you should care less. It means you should care more intentionally. When tired people date reactively, they choose convenience over compatibility, comfort over connection, familiarity over growth. And that's when patterns repeat most aggressively. Older men often settle into emotional minimalism. They reduce expression, reduce vulnerability, reduce expectations, hoping simplicity will bring peace. But emotional minimalism doesn't create peace. It creates emotional hunger. And hunger eventually looks for satisfaction elsewhere, often in distractions, avoidance, or quiet resentment. Older women often settle into emotional hyper-independence. They prove they don't need anyone, that they're fine alone, that they're complete as they are. While that strength is real, it can also become isolating. Partnership isn't about neediness. It's about interdependence. And when independence becomes emotional isolation, dating loses its collaborative spirit.